Okay, I think we can get started. So it's really great to have you here. This is the Open Mobility as a Service 101 webinar. So we're really happy to have you and really happy to have a group of panelists who are building a more open and interoperable vision of what mobility as a service could look like. So just to introduce you to our panel, we go to the next slide. So I'm Andrew. I run public policy at Transit, but more importantly, we have a great panel of people who are out there building these kinds of products in the real world. So we've got Tonya Anderson, who's the Senior Product Manager at RTD. We've got John Gordon, who's the Senior Director of Marketing, Strategy, Digital, and Advertising at LA Metro. We've got David Johnson, who's the VP of Planning and Strategy at KCATA, and Morgan Ramaker, who's the Executive Director at BCycle. So a really exciting group of people. And if you have any questions for our panelists as we go, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A function. And we've got magic elves behind the scenes who will make sure they get to the right panelists when the time comes. But before we go there, I wanted to give you a bit of a sense of why we are here and why you might care about it, which is, I think, the main purpose of this conversation. So if we give a little bit of background before I get into that, over the last 10 or 15 years, as I think many of you know, there's been a real explosion in new mobility services enabled by digital technology. So whether it's car share, ride share, scooters, bike share, many of you have used those modes. There's great things about them, but I think a persistent problem over the full life of this kind of new revolution in digital mobility has been the challenge of getting these systems to work together, both in the sense of working together for a single user who wants to access multiple services, or more generally at the level of public policy. And so that's happened, that kind of challenge of interconnecting has happened at the same time as we've seen a lot of hype around the concept of mobility as a service, or MaaS. And that concept has gotten so much hype that it even has its own family of stock imagery, which is where I found this picture. It's been around for so long as an idea that we've been promoting, but I think we're going to see that the results have been a little bit disappointing in practice so far. And so the idea here, if you haven't heard it already, is that all these new modes of transportation that are enabled by digital technology would work together seamlessly. You wouldn't have to think about how you hop into whatever new mode of transportation is on your street or in your town. And because they're so compelling, together it would build an alternative to car use and cities would magically get better. So I think that's been kind of the pitch. But one of the reasons that we're here and wrote this guidebook that we're launching today and are having this webinar is that I think the practical results have been a little disappointing. And I think there's kind of two avenues for disappointment we can talk about. So on the one hand, there's been a lot of public agencies that have gone out and kind of wanted to jump to the endpoint and say, we're going to build mobility as a service, and gone out and procured an app for that. And I hate to pick on Los Angeles because we love Los Angeles and we have John here from LA with us. But this is an experience a few years ago that was fairly high profile, where LA hired Xerox to build a kind of all-in-one app. And I think the reality of that experience, if you go to the next slide, has been what a lot of other agencies going on the same path have seen. Is that it's not unexpected that it's hard to do, right? It's hard to build a user base from scratch. And also, I think from a perspective of the developers who are building that app, sometimes they are building to satisfy boxes on a procurement checklist rather than being able to build in a way that works for their users, which makes it tough. So that's one thing we've seen in the MaaS world. And on the other front, I think a sort of ultimately also disappointing piece is that we've seen mobility operators attempt to get increasingly large and kind of buy up or control different pieces of the mobility ecosystem. I say this from personal experience. I used to work at Uber when the tagline was, becoming the Amazon of transportation. So there's lots of challenges with, I think, that approach as well. And it's not just Uber. There's a lot of people who have a belief and a desire to kind of control as much as possible of mobility. And I don't think we think that's really a long-term way to build a system that's in the public interest or even in the rider interest. So if you go to the next slide, I think the question we want to talk about today is there a different way to do it? And to do that, I want to start with an analogy and compare the tech experience in the field of communications. So if you think about email, right, the first reaction is probably that you get too much of it. But if you think about it a little bit, it's a pretty amazing system in that it's quietly so interoperable. If I use Gmail and you use Yahoo or a corporate account, our emails get to each other and we don't even think about that fact. And we don't notice that no one company controls the entire ecosystem. And the only reason that happened with email is that way back in the 1970s, there were data standards that were put in place that all email systems use today. And if you contrast that with Facebook Messenger, that's the logo in the bottom right. And if you want to send someone a message on Facebook Messenger, you have to download Facebook Messenger, even if you don't particularly like Facebook or you don't like the app interface, or frankly, you just have enough messaging apps as it is. And the reality that I've seen is that a lot of the big money being poured into digital mobility is building more, I think, to the model of Facebook Messenger than it is to email. And we think that a model that's more email-based a mobility world that's got more open data standards is both more interoperable, more transparent, more accountable, ultimately more sustainable and equitable, and I think also helps public procurement be more effective. And so that's the reason we wrote the guidebook that we're launching today. And if you look on the next slide, we have the download link for you. It's at transit.app/mobility-as-a-service, MaaS. You can check that out right now. That is live. And we have tons of experience and highlights of how this is being built in the real world and how we can build a digital mobility system that is open and interoperable. And the good news in that guide, if we go to the next slide, is that we don't have to start from scratch in mobility. We're actually doing really, really good work. We don't necessarily always celebrate it enough, but transit agencies in particular have led the way with GTFS. If you go back 15 years ago, TriMet in Portland was the first agency to be featured in Google Maps. And by doing that, they ultimately created a data standard called GTFS, which is now really widespread. If you go to the next slide, there are thousands of agencies across North America that share their schedule and ultimately real-time information with all the apps they use, including ours and including Google and many others. That's a great success story. But if you go back even 10 years, you will find that major transit agencies in North America were actually fighting this idea. And developers who managed to get access to schedule information were being fought by transit agencies who wanted to keep it under lock and key. And obviously we've changed perspective a lot. And now it's pretty ubiquitous that this information is freely available. And there's big benefits for people finding and using transit schedule information. And it's a really great foundation to build on. And I think the lesson of the guidebook that we're putting out, the guide today, is that we can actually do this again for other modes of transportation. We've done it for transit, and now we have to do it for all the new modes of transportation we've seen over the last 10 years. And the other good news is that we're actually already doing it again. So, 5 years ago, GBFS for bike share, scooters, car share was launched and is now being pretty widely adopted and adapted to different uses over time. Surprisingly, if you look at ride hail and taxi and microtransit, there actually isn't any equivalent for GTFS and GBFS for all those on-demand modes, but that too is changing. So Mobility Data, a nonprofit that many of us work with, is putting together a group to launch that data standard in the near future too. So we're hoping to knock off that piece that's been missing in the past. And many of you who work with these will know that everything I've just described will help you find and plan a trip, but you can't actually pay for it. So that last piece of payments is also really important. And some of our partners on the call can talk about their experience. But I want to highlight one specific example within payments, because there's positive stuff to build on here too. Over the last several years, a growing number of mobile ticketing providers have actually been building APIs that allow services like transit to let you pay for your transit ride in the same place that you find when your bus is arriving. And that's been super exciting for us as we've been able to work with partners on this slide. If you go to the next page, but we've been benefiting from that. The nice thing is it's not just us. So if you go to the next slide, there's a growing number of people who are consuming the APIs from those ticketing providers, whether it's Uber or Lyft or Google Maps, and also having easy access to transit payment. And we think that's great, right? It puts competition on us because we're not the only ones with the ability to buy a ticket, but it's the kind of competition we think is ultimately good in that it's focused on user experience and not focused on how much of the ecosystem any one provider can lock down. And I think really importantly, the lesson from mobile ticketing is that no one company can or should think they can do this all alone. So if you go to the last slide, what we've seen and what we highlight in the book, and we take a lot of pains in our guidebook to talk about all the other companies, public agencies, nonprofits who are building this open mobility ecosystem together, because we don't think that any one person can do this alone or really should do it alone. And that's the way to actually get this work done. So we'd love for you to check out the guide. Like I mentioned, it's at transit.app/mobility-as-a-service. You can check that out. And we have tons of guidance and examples about how we can build a more open mobility as a service ecosystem. So that's that. Now, a big part of the show is actually the panel. So I want to shift now and go to the next slide and start us off with Tonya. So Tonya Anderson from RTD, we're going to turn it over to you first to tell us a little bit about what you're building at RTD and how it's working towards this vision that we're talking about.
Thanks for the intro, Andrew, and I'm really happy to be here. So I'm a product manager at RTD, which is to some extent a very new role for public transportation, but I'm also an operations manager, so I bounce between the two. And at RTD Denver, we entered the mobile innovation revolution back in 2017 when we launched our mobile ticketing app. So you can go ahead, next slide. We started off with our white label app, and very soon after, about a year or so later, we launched a new Uber app. it was a really exciting time. We were seeing incredible growth in our mobile ticketing channel. Year over year, the mobile channel was beating out some of the other products, such as paper products or smart card products, and even ticket vending machines in our fare box revenue. We soon after launching with Uber, we launched with Transit. And then back in 2020, despite the pandemic, we launched mobile ticketing in Lyft. And the real compelling reason for launching these additional third-party channels through Maasabi's SDK and other APIs is because we wanted public transportation to be everywhere. Anyone that is interested in looking for mobility options other than their personal car, we wanted to be part of that customer's decision and trade-off. And I think that by public transportation not focusing on just their white label app, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have a white label app. I think it's important. It's part of RTD's pride and joy to a certain extent to have our own white labeled branded app. But to be able to extend the convenience of purchasing transit tickets and other third-party apps is just really important, that we think about our other customers who may not want to download a specific app to purchase one ticket to ride to the airport once. We want to be able to be everywhere. In addition to these, our third-party channels, we had great experience with all of these channels, with Uber, with Transit, and Lyft. We decided to apply for a grant. So next slide. And in this grant through FTA, we were awarded the Accelerating Innovative Mobility Challenge grant through FTA. And in this grant, we hope to demonstrate the ability for a customer to not only book and pay a bus ride through Bustang, which is our partner with the Colorado Department of Transportation, not only to purchase our tickets, but to also integrate and plan and book a scooter trip, for instance, and even unlocking a scooter. This project started off after a failed project. We tried it in our white label app, it didn't work, but we looked to Transit and they were able to help us with this project of integrating multimodal payment integration with trip planning as well. I hope that during this FTA demonstration period, we can contribute to the mobility ecosystem with open APIs and open standards that will be able to gather data, information, and share with other transit agency and this mobility vertical about the potential and the ability for customers to book these multiple trips. Do they really want to book these multiple trips? How often are they booking? To be able to answer those questions and to share. I'm really excited. I think that in terms of the mobility ecosystems and integrating with other apps, we've just really started. Thank you.
Thanks, Tonya. That's so great. And I didn't mention up top, but we've asked our panelists to keep their amazing experience very brief. So if you thought Tonya was speaking for only a short amount of time, it's because we forced her to. So we appreciate you getting all that great content into 3 minutes. I'm going to turn it over to John Gordon at LA Metro. Take it away, John.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And I just have to say, I just love saying the word Bustang out loud. That is my favorite thing. Next slide. So I'm John. I'm the Senior Director of Marketing Strategy at Metro, and I live in Los Angeles. And just a warning to you all, I'm going to talk about marketing. Aren't we here to talk about policy and data and GTFS? Oh my God. So blame your hosts. They've invited the marketing guy. Next slide. So why do we get up in the morning? To design, create, and operate transportation in Los Angeles for the public good. Public good is what distinguishes Metro's and defines Metro's responsibility in the mobility marketplace. It's our job to create transportation options that are equitable, safe, and sustainable. We exist to keep a public good thumb on the scale. And this matters to us in a big way. It's why many of us at Metro decided to work at Metro instead of the private sector. No judgment. But public good outcomes are not going to convince people to get out of their car. If we want healthier, safer, and a more equitable Los Angeles, we need to produce a competitive product. See, marketing. I warned you. So producing competitive mobility products starts by taking a product mentality. Tonya mentioned this, and putting the needs of our customers dead center in every decision we make. Next slide. So for Metro's mobility products to thrive and scale, we got to satisfy our customers' core needs. And you can see them there in the center: cost, ease, safety, and speed. We need to provide transportation options that simply feel like the easiest, safest, least stressful, and most affordable way to get wherever Angelinos want to go. And this is why I'm so excited about Transit's new handbook and hashtag integration first. Open mobility is the key to removing customer barriers, raising their expectations, which I think is something that we need to focus on a lot, and being competitive. The decision to walk, bike, scoot, or ride a bus needs to be as simple as the decision to pick up the keys and walk out the door. Paying for your trip needs to be as easy and thought-free as paying for groceries. I'm confident we can get there, and it's why I get up in the morning, and it starts with conversations and collaborations like we have today. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for Transit for bringing us together.
Great, thanks, John. As a reminder, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A function. I've seen somebody raising hands, but easier if you put it in the Q&A. We can have me, the moderator, read them to the panelists and keep things moving along. So thanks, John. I'm going to turn it over to David Johnson at KCATA.
Thanks, Andrew. Good afternoon, everyone. If you're, I guess, in our time zone. David Johnson with the Kansas City Area Transportation Authority. We, along with 4 other agencies, operate under the Ride KC brand, which is a regional brand, and now a series of information tools, customer information tools that present all of those various operators' information in a single data feed. So as I mentioned, those 5 operators, of which we are one, we each have a different set of tools running the systems, or running the transit systems that we own and operate. And so our friends at Swiftly were very helpful in integrating all of that data into a single regional feed without having to rip out CAD AVL systems and various ops softwares, and leverage a lot of other data sources like our onboard routers that happen to have GPS radios in them to make a single feed for both planning and tracking trips. I'm a recovering app developer, worked at a series of firms, and so I think what I bring to KCATA is an ability to separate fact from marketing fiction. No offense, John. Everyone thinks they've got the best algorithm and is ready to sell you on a pilot and do something in microtransit. But obviously, not everyone can have the best algorithm. And at this point, this is really about having an integration first mentality. Next slide, please. And that's been our approach to mobility as a service, probably really for the last year, as we went through a series of other pilots. We had our own white label app. We launched sort of an accessible sort of non-ADA taxi-based service called Freedom on Demand that provided more coverage than traditional paratransit. And none of those vendors really were either willing or able to talk to the other ones. And so when we hooked up with a transit app, we discovered a whole new world of sort of integration first thinking. And so fortunately, we're mostly in a zero fare environment for our fixed routes. So the payment piece is not something we have to worry about too much, which is the thorniest piece, right? But our partners, which you see listed here, have really been stepping up to help us bring that sort of single app experience. And of course, MaaS is much more than just a single app, but we've been kind of trying to get that piece in order first before we go beyond into the deeper aspects of MaaS. So again, wanted to shout out to Transit App for being super helpful. We've got a couple of 3 actual pilots in the works right now, mostly in the demand responsive space. We received a COVID-19 research grant to do electronic validators on microtransit vehicles, and then 2 non-federal grant funded projects or funded projects in microtransit to integrate 2 separate vendors into Transit App for trip planning and tracking. Transloc with our state friends in the state of Kansas, and then using local Kansas City, Missouri funding to partner up with Spare.
That's great. Thanks, David. And I'm seeing lots of good questions coming in on the Q&A. So a reminder to use that if you have questions for David or anybody else, we'll get to them in the moderated Q&A portion. So last but certainly not least, Morgan Ramaker, want to welcome you as our non-transit agency representative. It's good to have your perspective from BCycle. So take it away.
Thank you so much. And yes, just as John said, they invited a marketing person, they invited a private sector person too. But for me, I can say I'm really honored to be part of this great group of panelists. And I've spent my career going back and forth between the public and private sector and feel really fortunate to be in a position to work across those spaces now, really focused on driving things forward in terms of access to transportation. If you could go to the next slide, I just wanted to start out with a little bit of what we're about. BCycle is a subsidiary of Trek Bicycle, and our purpose, reason for being over the past 10 years plus has been to get more people on bikes and to change the world by getting more people on bikes. So you see here a bike in our Madison BCycle system alongside our Metro Transit. And we have really taken the approach of the bike being, or bike share being the bicycle's role within public transit. And that's how we approach things here. And really, like I said, trying to increase access. And a key component of that, if you go to the next slide, came with some of the data that we've gotten since we launched e-bikes, which I'm sure many of you have seen this. And we found that a lot of riders are just not using their cars often because of BCycle. And that really speaks to that goal of changing the world by getting more people on bikes, looking how we can be a bigger part of reducing single occupancy vehicle traffic. If you go to the next slide, I'll just share a little bit of an example of that. We recently launched a pilot in Las Vegas with RTC, Bike Transit, and Transit to provide just that, access to bike share, to transit options, and really opening up a lot of doors there, taking bike share users who perhaps hadn't used other transit options and making it really easy for them to do that all at the same time in the same space, and vice versa. Maybe there are some transit riders who hadn't considered bikes as part of their transportation puzzle, and maybe now they will look at, as they get off of their transit option, picking up a bike to solve that first mile, last mile equation. So it's been really great to work with these organizations to bring this to life. It's something we've been working on for some time, and really excited to see where it can go in the future and how we can continue to work with public agencies to get the best of all worlds coming together to provide those first mile, last mile solutions through bikes.
Thank you, Morgan. That's great. I think I have just one or two slides just to wrap up before we get to the Q&A. So I think if I had to summarize the entire book in one slide, which is always a good thing to do, although I encourage you to check it out, I think if we're thinking about how do we make more of the kind of things happen that we're talking about, there's kind of 3 bullet points. In some places, there are data standards that are already super well established, like GTFS or GBFS, for public transit, bike share, scooters, and increasingly car share. So in those places, if you're a public agency, you can push for or even require people to provide those feeds. It's relatively simple to ask for it because it already exists. In some places, like I mentioned, whether it's on-demand transit or taxi, ride hail, there actually isn't a data standard yet. So some of the important work that we're part of with many other partners is, could we come up with a data standard that would start to make it easier for us to ask for those feeds to be included in some of the open mobility as a service platforms we're talking about. And last but not least, and this was alluded to a couple times, payment is kind of the hardest nut to crack in this space. And there are not yet any obvious APIs for mobile ticketing, or sorry, API standards. There are lots of individual APIs that providers have built. And so one thing to think about if you're commissioning mobile ticketing in your market is you can reward vendors or ask for vendors that have public APIs and proven experience doing integration. So where there's no standards, you can always see what's happened in the past. So that's a really short summary, but as a reminder, the full guide that we put together is launched today. I think the website's on the next slide. So I encourage you to go check it out. And I think that wraps up our presentation portion. We're going to go to Q&A. So like I mentioned, I have a few sort of moderator prerogative questions that we've been talking about ahead of time, but there's been lots of good questions coming in. So please keep them coming and we will sort them out. I have a teammate helping me out to kind of go through them and slot them in order. So there's lots of good stuff in there. And we've kept most of the time of this presentation to do questions. So hopefully we can get to most, if not all, and keep them coming. So just to start it off, I think, we kind of, I would say we stacked the deck a little bit in terms of our panel, right? I think that we reached out to you guys because we already know you're building projects in a way that's kind of high level aligned with what we're talking about in terms of interoperability and how that's important to different elements of what you're working on. But I guess I would ask, where do you see the pressure coming from to make that interoperability actually happen? And I would say it's not the default position. In some ways, it's sort of the underdog position from where I sit. So where's the pressure coming from in the other direction? What's keeping us from doing more of this? So you can pick up either side of that. What's allowing you to do the work that's making things interoperable, and where are you seeing pressure go the other way? If anybody wants to jump in first, I'm happy to take whoever's most eager to answer that question.
This is David. I'll go ahead and jump in. I don't think I coined the phrase integration first, but certainly I'm a big believer in that. We've started telling the vendor community that when we put out proposals or enter into pilots. I think it's just frustration with the lack of a standard. And I was going to mention in my opening comments, but I kind of held back. We have two sort of rulemaking or two groups that we work with most of the time that love rules and standards. That would be FTA and APTA. And in this space, there's kind of been a leadership gap. And so I think that's changing, but it's taken a while. And I think as agencies who are always cash strapped, even in a good economy and non-pandemic, are being saddled with the costs of these one-off integrations when we really should be operating in an environment like GTFS and GBFS, where everyone has a common set of rules and you just support that, and then integration is easy, relatively easy.
Thanks, David.
I could just add that I think the barrier is mostly inertia at transit agencies. We basically are operating still under systems and analogies that are largely molded and defined by analog, the analog world of 20, 30 years ago. Where I see pressure applying is the marketplace, where we are losing ridership, and we, as I mentioned, we're not putting out a product that is competitive, that people can embrace, and we're seeing the kind of fruits of that. I'm very interested in things happening in California, Cal, ITP, working on setting statewide standards and potentially, down the road, attaching funding to those standards, adoption of those standards. So I think there's a strong desire within agencies to change, recognition that we have to, but a lot of that, gif of the two Spider-Mans pointing at each other going, is it you, is it me, is it you, is it me? So the outside pressure, the marketplace pressure, and then any kind of like governing bodies that can apply and set standards at that scale is definitely something that is going to help straighten us up and simplify things for us inside agencies.
Great. Tonya, can I call on you, just because I feel like I've seen from RTD, as you highlighted in your slide, having your mobile ticket experience in not just Uber, but also Lyft, but also transit, feels like that's further ahead of the curve than many places. So how did you guys make that happen? How did that happen there and not so many other places?
Yeah, it really happened very organically. So even our mobile ticketing app, we didn't go through an arduous, long planning process. And I know there's probably planners, service planning folks in the call on the webinar that might not be very happy to hear that, but it really did happen that way. Our general manager at that time, Dave Genova, went to a conference and saw some of the success stories from other transit agencies, and we were struggling with our antiquated smart card fare collection system. It was great at the time, but it was just getting older. And he just said, we need to do something better for our customers. We need to provide a more convenient way to do it. We need to do mobile. And so we launched our mobile ticketing app after about only a year of work. And then when Masabi mentioned the opportunity to integrate with third parties, we just jumped on it. I think what mobile ticketing and all these APIs and integrations and using open standards and working with new vendors that are in the mobility space that are very agile, it allows transit agencies an opportunity to experiment and take a chance where you make a decision and you go through the door, but it's not like pouring concrete or building a light rail station. You're just launching an app, and you can actually turn around and say, this is not working, and then go back out the other way. So.
Right. Thanks, Tonya. Morgan, just to pick on you and ask a question, I feel like one of the things we're talking about a lot in this guidebook is data standards and using things like GBFS, which obviously you're very familiar with, and I think many people on the call are. But the average person who's interested in using a bike share system, probably isn't, and their eyes might glaze over if you start talking about data standards. So how do you find the kind of work we're talking about, interoperability data standards, actually ends up making a difference to consumers or transit riders?
Sure. I mean, they might not know what GBFS stands for, but they know that when they open Google Maps, Apple Maps, a number of other things, they're going to see the bike share stations and see where there are bikes and docks available. And so kind of having that ability to translate that data into not only our app, but a lot of other publicly available apps is a pretty tangible benefit. And it's been great to see that develop, and as the industry continues to evolve, looking at what are the other needs and benefits that additional data can provide.
Great. Okay, we're getting a ton of questions from the audience, which is great. So I'm going to go ahead and start picking a few up. We've got some of them kind of in order that they came in. And so if people would like to respond, I'm going to throw it out there, and if you guys want to jump in. But one of the questions came in about working with TNCs to convince them to sort of be open for API access for trip planning or fare payment. So I know a few of you have mentioned working with TNCs or microtransit companies in different contexts. So, to those of you who've had good experiences, how has that worked? What's the background? Tell us more. Who wants to jump in? Maybe David, you've talked a bit about that from KCATA to start.
Yeah, I mean, since we don't have to worry a whole lot about fare integration, that came with the transit app. So when we launched transit app, I think you had already looped us into bus and TNC multimodal trip planning, and that was great. We didn't have to really do anything other than just announce it, and have continued to reap the benefits of being able to put those different modes together just with an existing relationship, because you guys are big believers in that approach. So we do have a homegrown TNC here called ZTrip, and so they also are part of the same organization that runs our Freedom on Demand taxi-based non-ADA service. And so we've been trying to get them to open up so that we can integrate, because that's a long-term contract for service, contracted service. And we haven't been very successful yet, but we think that they see the value. ZTrip very much has been positioning itself as sort of a homegrown Uber Lyft competitor, according to the local regulations here for TNCs. And so we think that there's some benefit long-term with that. We also could just ask them to run that service on another platform that is integration first, and have been looking at that as an option as well.
Anyone else want to talk through experience with TNCs or microtransit and integration there?
Sure, I'll jump in. We've also struggled with working with TNCs in terms of data sharing from a broader perspective, and we just haven't been successful, but I'm hopeful. I think they're very important part of this ecosystem. I think one of the lessons, couple of the lessons I learned, at least through our experience working with Uber and with Lyft, is that just to understand their point of view, leading with empathy, and understanding that public transportation and government agencies want a lot of data, but yet we're not necessarily contributing extensively to their platform, and to just kind of align better in terms of not just saying, yes, you're right, I'm not actually paying Uber to design their app, for instance, but to maybe align a little better in terms of how public transportation and cities are actually contributing to their business model. That's one. And then the other strategy is to have, if we can come to agreement and have a shared goal. That was really what was most successful. It helped us being successful with launching on all of our third-party apps, is having these shared goals that we can kind of like a North Star point to help us get across the finish line. I don't have the answer. If anybody does, that would be great. But I think it's still worth the work.
Great.
And I would just echo Tanya's point about shared goals. Well, BCycle is certainly not a TNC. Finding those areas where we can achieve things together for us. In the past, we had taken a little bit more protective approach to our data. And as we look to our goal and objective of getting more people on bikes, it's about reducing barriers. So as we looked at the goals from transit with the folks in Vegas, et cetera, that was something that we could all rally around together and figure out a solution that would reduce more barriers. And there's certainly more work to be done, but that was really what made it successful for us and brought us on board.
And just to build on that, looking for those kind of new opportunities, one of the things that we're exploring right now is a rescue ride program. So, you know, our bus service has been impacted, and the quality of the bus service obviously been impacted by the pandemic, and we do have a lot of canceled runs and delays in our service. So we're currently working on a rescue ride program pilot where we work with a TNC to be able to identify riders in situations where their bus has been delayed or canceled and offer them a ride in that moment to finish their route. And that's something that we will be piloting in the next year and working with transit. So I think it's, you know, look for the kind of new opportunities, new models, new ways to add value to the customer, which is, you know, that's, I think, the one thing that we have in common is sharing that customer, and increasingly their options are many, and we just need to kind of complement and recognize how we can build that marketplace for non-driving.
Right. Great, thanks, John and others. I'm going to go to Ellen's question in the Q&A, which is a question about payment integration. So we've heard a couple examples. I think we talked, Tonya was nice enough to talk about the work with Masabi. Ellen's question is there a preferred path for getting to payment integration, which I mentioned, I think we've all kind of hit on is maybe the hardest part. Where do you start and where do you go next? And David, I think you had the easiest answer, which is maybe that you're not having people pay for a fixed route right now. So that kind of takes that problem off the table. But I don't know, John, if you guys want to talk about how you're thinking about payment in this context for transit.
Yeah, so it's, I mean, you know, that's the big question. I mean, ideally, like I mentioned earlier, it should be as easy as paying for coffees, paying for the groceries. So the idea of, you know, open payment as the model and where we get is something that is very, very attractive to us. It logically, it doesn't make sense that, you know, your entire world is oriented around your ability to just pay and with no thought to accounts or anything, except in the world of transit where suddenly, you know, you have to jump through all these hoops and barriers. So I think that's ideally where we want to be. You know, obviously Metro, we're in August likely to start a fareless pilot. So, you know, that's something where our agency is also heading, is the possibility of fareless. So payment becomes maybe less of a barrier, but the ability to stay connected to the rider, gather that trip data for planning purposes becomes a challenge. So, you know, if we go fareless, that problem kind of solves itself on fare integration, but we still will have needs to kind of connect us to the rider and figure out how to do that in the most seamless way possible.
Great. And John,
yeah, and Andrew, to add on to that, unfortunately our answer isn't quite so simple because we do continue charging for on-demand services. So, you know, anything microtransit, flex once it's upgraded to on-demand, all that demand responsive stuff that you know doesn't require call-ahead scheduling, we'll continue to charge a fare. But that's a little bit easier to manage. Those systems are mostly app-based anyway, and so you know we don't have a legacy system to worry about there, which is a positive.
Great. Okay, John, someone referenced your existence here. They said, so Sanathan said, love the fact that you brought the marketing guy to the table and used your presence as a frame for a question about white label apps. I think I, you know, gave a bit of a, funny take on some of the white label experience, but maybe I would say potentially overly negative from my perspective. So someone mentioned that, you know, with white label apps that are being developed on behalf of an agency, you know, may not be a tech challenge, but also a marketing challenge. You know, how does anybody find out about and actually use these services when you build them? So the question is, aside from open standards, what other activities can transit agencies take to raise awareness of new apps and services if they choose to go that route? So I don't know if anybody has experience with, promoting an app that you've built in-house or commissioned, or how you've thought about that, or what might work better or worse.
Well, it's not easy. I mean, it's a product, and the app stores and Google Play stores are discovery is very hard. Marketing within that context is very hard. Ideally, when we're telling people to try a new service, like Micro here, which we just launched, my philosophy, and I think our philosophy, is the easiest path to discovery is to intercept trips that are already being planned and made. So integration with transit is kind of key to that. So the call to action is not download this app and discover what this new service is. It's, hey, you're planning to make this trip from point A to point B. You could make that trip on Micro, book it on Micro. So for us, that's where the integration piece becomes kind of key to all of this, is we don't have to market an app and build a user base, which is complicated and hard. And frankly, transit agencies don't have the best track record of doing those things. So the path of least resistance for us is that integration, is the ability to get in front of somebody who is already interested in taking that ride, and then offer them an alternative that may be more competitive in terms of time or price or ease or comfort or what have you.
That's actually a really good segue to a question from Stein that is basically describing what you're just talking about, John. But many of the integrations are interesting. This is his question: are interesting for people who are already using transit, but how are you attracting car users? So in some ways you were addressing this question, but maybe to the rest of you, Tonya, Morgan, David, how are we actually getting the message out to people to actually change behavior, which at the end of the day, I think is the point of all this data standard stuff. I don't know who wants to jump in there. Maybe Tonya or Morgan?
Yeah, I don't know. There could be a compelling reason, right, for people to get out of their cars. And what is that compelling reason? Convenience. I think we are doing a really good job with GTFS and having the real-time information in apps to let people know that this bus is going to be late and there's going to be another one in 10 minutes. But it's about convenience and having personal choice and control and being able to pivot during your travels. How does public transportation mimic that? That's tough, right? Because a vehicle is for one person, and we've got a bus for 50 people or so that all have to share. So I don't have the answer. I don't have any answers today. No.
You got 4 panelists, so we can bounce around, Tonya.
Well, one of the things we've noticed is that I mentioned this, the decision to drive is the easiest decision. You literally just grab your keys and walk out the door. Then what happens next becomes far more complicated. You get into traffic, you have to look for parking, you got tickets, maintenance, all of those things. So, and transit is kind of the inverse of that. It's very, very hard to get out the door, but once you get on a bus or train or anything, a scooter, it's easy. And there's so much value to that experience of time and community and then all the other kind of positive attributes of not driving alone. So it's this is the challenge of our time. And, my joke is always that I sell buses and trains in the car capital of the world. And it's a challenge, but, we just need to identify that value proposition. And then again, at the end of the day, have a product that is competitive, where if there is a difference of 5 to 10 minutes, that's not a big deal. And then obviously we can always compete on price. But it's a big challenge, and there is no magic bullet, because not all riders are the same, and their motivations and the barriers and the emotions attached to these things are different. So it is that's what keeps me up at night. Yeah.
Okay, there's been a lot of very good questions about, generally speaking, about equity and people who are unbanked. So I'm going to try and do justice to the many questions from Joshua, Lena, Carol, and others. Basically saying, at one level, most transit riders are low income and a lot pay with cash. So how does MaaS have an impact for those people? How does this whole thing we're talking about, serve riders that are unbanked or underbanked or unlimited data plans. And generally speaking, given how much we're focused on equity in transportation these days, how are we addressing making tech-enabled services accessible to all? So that's kind of one big broad theme that I would love to hear from all of you who are interested. Maybe Tonya, can I start with you? Is that unfair? How are you guys thinking about?
I'm good.
No,
I'm
in
fine.
a tech space, equity?
Yes. So although the mobile adoption has been high, we've done some surveys in Denver where we know that 80% of our customers have a smartphone and they have adequate data. We've also surveyed our low-income customers and know that about 65 to 70% have a smartphone, although I think the data availability is slightly lower. I don't have that number off the top of my head. So we do have a lot of discussions at RTD about this huge push to mobile and what about the unbanked and the underbanked and even those that are tech adverse, right? They may have a phone, but they don't necessarily want to use their brand new Samsung S2021 on a train at 11 o'clock at night, for instance, for paying for fare. But I think what we have learned is that with these new fare collection systems and these new platforms that are launching is that there is integration with retail networks. And so these retail networks will allow us to digitize cash, to accept cash. Everybody's nodding yes, yes. And I think retails are great, but retail's not everywhere. That's been some of the feedback that we're getting is that, yes, that would be great if you did it at some, convenience store, but that convenience store is not on every street corner. But it is an option that we have. It's an option that we're going to use in Denver to hopefully expand to as many retail networks and locations as possible, not just the chains, but, the mom and pops as well.
The key for us is that, the open mobility gives us the ability to extend these services to wherever the customers want them. So if it is at the retail location, we can do that. If it is with integration with other government services, that's great as well. So, I think we should just give everybody a smartphone with everything loaded on it, and that would definitely help solve a lot of issues. So and frankly, the cost of something like that probably would be very reasonable in the long run compared to all of the other complicated, Rube Goldberg type situations that we're creating to try to get to folks. But I think at the end of the day, for us, it just comes down to recognizing exactly who our customers are, what their preferences are, and then designing solutions for those individual situations. Our customers, about 80% of them are low income, and we have similar issues in terms of, the vast majority of those folks do have smartphones and data plans. And so part of our challenge also is a perception problem in saying that if we're designing for a digital first experience, that somehow that is not an equity take. But the reality is that providing seamless service for people is probably over these digital channels is probably the single greatest thing we can do for equity, and then figure out how we make it similarly easy for everybody else who has a kind of unique set of situations. And we need to design with the same kind of approach for how do we satisfy their needs.
Yeah, and from the transit side, we've been engaged in some of the programs around ticketing to enable cash payment, converting that into digital mobile wallets. But I think the other thing, to John's point, we've seen on the transit side that our user base is overwhelmingly mimics the transit riding population, and in particular during COVID, was primarily composed of essential workers and lower income, a heavy proportion of visible minorities, and those people are using transit app, right? It's not as though we're a digital first service. Obviously, I think it's been a lifeline as well. So it's not as though, to your point, all digital services is inherently moving away from the goals of equity, but it's important to be careful and thoughtful in the way you guys are talking about. So that's great. We've got so many questions coming in. It's really overwhelming. If we don't get to all of them, which I think at this point is probably likely, I can say that I think many of the questions will be answered in the report. And if they're not, we always love to talk offline as well. So we'll make sure to provide our email. So this has been great. So I want to ask a question about data standards. I think I talked a lot about this up front. At the same time, we're talking about innovation and being agile. And you might hear those two things and think they're in opposition, right? If we start to standardize everything, aren't we losing the ability to actually create new services and be nimble and respond to customer needs? So is there a tension between trying to get to standards too quickly while also allowing things to happen and evolve? This came in from Christopher. I don't have anybody in mind, but I hope that some of you want to weigh in there and discuss. Okay, David, perfect.
Yeah, I think taking the long view in surface transportation overall, you really don't see real innovation on the product side, right? It's all about the customer interface where there's innovation. Because if you think about it, we're all still running fixed route, fixed schedule services kind of the same way they've been run since the history of public transportation. The demand responsive thing predates Uber, Lyft, and Transloc and Spare. So really the only thing being added is a modernization layer on a service that already existed pre-internet, pre-iPhone. So not to sound like a real down message here, but we really need to focus on making sure the service is high quality and the information being provided is accurate, and that's where those open standards come in. If people open up transit apps, sorry about the phone, and the real-time arrival information is accurate and the crowding information is accurate, then they may say, okay, I'm willing to invest in a data plan if they have the resources to do that, or rely on this more than a paper schedule if they're able to do that. And then eventually it just gets to a point where we're now at 80+% saturation with smartphone in all of our customer audiences. And so, but I guess the point is that the real innovation has just really been on that layer. And the integration that we're talking about today is just within that layer. There really isn't much to be said for, the efficiency aspect of these algorithms in the demand responsive space. Sorry, vendor community, but the expense of operating those services is labor and vehicles and fuel, and that really isn't being modernized in any way unless you contract it out and pay people less, which isn't really much of an innovation. That's actually really a social ill. So that's going to be my comment on innovation for the day.
Right. Anyone else want to pick up on the tension between standardization and innovation? If not, we got a good bank question to keep working through. So I can plow right ahead and try and make some more people happy by bringing up their questions. So Stein, I think we've taken a question earlier, but I like this one too. So, we're talking about an open mobility as a service system. And the question Stein asks is, who should play the role of connector in this open mobility system? So anybody want to take that on? Who should be the connector to the extent that there is a connector? Should there be one connector? Does somebody want to weigh in? Maybe John, you want to talk about what you're doing at LA Metro?
Well, I think, we should. And again, it gets back to the idea of the public good outcomes that are central to our stakes in this. I think that, these challenges can be solved in a lot of different ways, but, to the previous question about equity, and, we're all concerned about climate change and sustainable outcomes and making cities more livable. That's our role and our responsibility. And like I said, that's where we need, I think, to play an important role in keeping our thumb on that scale in these conversations, because some private mobility providers are not going to be factoring these into their calculations about where to provide coverage. So, and that's not, our role is not to just be, stern marm, but I think we think of ourselves as a mobility operating system in LA County, and we have kind of three levers. We have policy, we have money, and we have data that can inform and drive the market around some of these decisions. So I think it comes down to us just kind of raising our hand and accepting that role, and then using those three levers strategically to kind of drive the outcomes that we think are in the best interest of the public good.
Great. Well, I've got two questions that I'm going to pair together from Steve and Michael, which are about how are we using these new systems that we can connect more modes like transit and bike share, for instance, to think about either subsidizing efficient multimodal service and or how are we using the kind of platforms and data standards we're talking about to communicate existing incentives, right? There are a lot of incentives out there, including for bike share. Morgan, maybe you can talk about, are we more able to actually get those to the people who want to use them through the kinds of platforms that we're talking about? So how do we think about subsidizing benefit programs in a world of more open mobility as a service? I don't know, Morgan, it'd be great if you start us off.
Sure. I mean, it goes back to the reducing barriers and introducing a new group of potential riders to another option. And in a lot of communities, there are those discounted programs that can offer greater access. And it's just, how do you get the word out? How do you get people using it and aware of that? And having a platform where more people are seeing and interacting with it just opens up the possibilities there.
Great. Anyone else want to get the last word before we start to wrap things up? I think we're getting close to the end.
Well, this is David. As a sort of a smaller market compared to some of my peers here, we've struggled to attract these new services just because we're not seen as an attractive launch place or anything like that. So car sharing is the perfect example. We had car share for maybe 5 years, I think, and then it just didn't work as a for-profit enterprise. And so we've looked at subsidizing it, similar to how we subsidize the bike share system here, and as in return it got our brand. And so that's the struggle that we have as a mid-sized market or even tier 2 market, is we're going to really have to throw money at these services because the private sector doesn't see a profit in a market like this, and that's a challenge when we've got other things to fund and operate.
For sure. Okay, well, that is a place to end. I think Kansas City is a great market. I'd love to go there. I feel like I had a lot of good times in Kansas City. If I could run the car share business there, it sounds like a good time. So hopefully some of the stuff we're talking about can help make those kinds of services easier. And I just want to say it's been great to have a lot of you in the audience to be here. It's been great to have a really amazing group of panelists, and the number of questions we got actually overwhelmed me. I was trying to keep track and get as many as we could, but to the extent we didn't get to all of them, I hope that the guide, which is available right now, if you go to transit.app and look up mobility as a service, we put a lot of work into it. I think it's got a lot of highlighting some of the great work you heard about on this call is in that book as well. So we're excited about it. Check it out. And I just want to thank you for being here and thank our panelists for their participation. And I think we're going to be one of the rare webinars that can land this ship before the time and give everybody time to get to their next meeting. So we really want to thank you for coming out. Please download the guide, share it with your friends, and let us know what you think.